Marc Lambourne, welcome back to the Business of Betting podcast. It's a pleasure to have you back on.
This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Australia. No matter where you are in the world, if you're looking to find your edge in sports betting or racing, you'll need to visit the Betfair Hub. From analysis to betting psychology, it has everything that you need. Simply visit betfair.com.au/hub.
Marc Lambourne, welcome back to the Business of Betting podcast. It's a pleasure to have you back on.
I'm surprised it's been 3 years, Jake. Obviously, there's been vast changes in racing in Australia, both mostly political, but there's obviously a lot to talk about since we last caught up. And we're now entering a particularly weird phase, both world-wise and racing-wise. Coronavirus has pretty much shut down most of the world. But racing in Australia continues, much to the consternation of parts of our society. So whilst we see it as an opportunity to showcase racing because we're the only game that's going on, at the same time we're attracting a bit of stigma because we've, by dint of the political personalities that run racing, we've managed to soldier on, but that's not making everyone happy at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't mind speculating a little later on in the show about what that might bring or how it might unfold over the next few months and then what impact that might have later on. But before we get to those topics, I want to urge everyone to go back and listen to the first episode we did, albeit a number of years ago now, as you referenced, but I think still very relevant and a lot of great information that you did share. To kick things off here, I want to talk about a syndicate that you spent some time at, and recently you released some content around that with Mr. Taylor, and you guys put that into the world. So I wanted to just touch on that, and I guess from a starting point, how did your time there change you or shape you and how you thought about racing or how you just thought about the process generally?
Well, it was a turning point really in my racing career because up until that point, let's say I'd been in racing for 25 years at that point, but really thought that I knew everything, and that's a trap that many players can fall into. And it wasn't until I'd sort of run aground, my bookmaking career had run aground at that point, and I was casting around for new opportunities, fresh opportunities in racing, and they all seemed to coincide at the end of last century. And this Humbleton mob that suddenly popped up advertising in the Sportsman at the time, took me on a sharp and short journey. I responded to that advertisement, and that made me aware. I think I mentioned in my soundbite that there was a sort of a repository of sharp racing information that existed outside the racetrack, and not only that, they were really cutting-edge ideas that they'd, I guess, introduced to a number of hand-picked consultants. And so that exposed me, I guess, to, or sort of ramped up my my knowledge in a sort of a rapid way. I was, firstly, it was almost like I was chastened, because I realised that, whilst I thought I knew a lot, there was a lot I still didn't know. And there was this mob that was operating in a corporate fashion, very secretively corporate fashion, and they were disseminating these cutting-edge ideas amongst their analysts. And I then spent 2 or 3 years almost being berated by them for not fitting in with their techniques, but at the same time, because I was allowing myself to be exposed and the word I used was chastened before, by their sort of knowledge, it definitely took me to another level in a hurry. I never had many clues about how the organisation was put together. I understood that this infamous Jelko was at the head of things. I did get to meet him many years later because he's great mates with Rob Waterhouse, but never as part of that Humbleton experiment that I participated in.
So this idea of leveling up, often it's described as linear, or it's an accumulation of time and knowledge, and it can't necessarily be jumping up levels. Did you find that you might have been able to jump a few levels just by being exposed to other people, other ideas, other philosophies that you wouldn't otherwise have been exposed to, or more broadly, we as a general public wouldn't necessarily get exposed to?
Well, there's two aspects to that. So firstly, you need to be aware of the fact that you don't know everything. And it's easy to be arrogant, particularly if you are performing well. No, I'm not saying that I was performing particularly well at that time, but so you need to sort of humble yourself in some way to be able to expose yourself to ideas and concepts that you may not have considered previously. So the real benefit of my time at Humbleton was the fact that I suppose I was exposed to a bit of American racing, and that led me on to, let's say, Andy Bayer's books, and then Tom Brohammer's books. I became quite captivated with some of the ideas of American racing, which I then managed to employ in my Australian racing experience. Up until that point, we'd sort of looked over at America and said, well, look, there's not much form talk or published form talk in Australia. There's a lot of publications in America, but they're mostly about dirt racing, and they don't apply in Australia. Well, that's true in some ways, but I mean, the thing is that there are learnings to be had from other jurisdictions that you can adapt and employ well. And I think the Humbleton experience was, hey, look, here's a style of racing that you can critique in a particular way, and there's a lot to be gained from that critiquing that you can then redeploy in your own environment.
Do you think there's a way that Humbleton, or how can Humbleton be good for racing? Obviously, it's a syndicate. It does what it does. Is there a way that it, or currently, or when you were there, that it's a positive impact overall on racing? Obviously, there's the turnover aspect to it, and obviously from there's discussions around rebates and a whole lot of other things. But do you see a way that we can find a positive spin on how Humbleton can be viewed?
Well, from my point of view, rebates aside, it has been an enormously positive influence in racing because it's ratcheted the game up. It's come in as a level of sophistication that's meant that the players in our game have had to adapt in some way, and it's also offered some type of university for those of us that were lucky enough to be exposed to their sort of cutting edge ideas. So I'm very grateful that I had that experience. It's the some of the work that I did was a touch on the banal side, in the sense that it's not that much fun. Just watching and rewatching videos of horses that you have no knowledge of from a far off jurisdiction. But I certainly think that it aided my development as a form player in a big way.
Do you think there is any other comparable family tree in terms of racing and betting that has come out outside of Humbleton? Obviously, it sounds like the list of pupils is long and distinguished. Do you think there's anything else that rivals that in terms of just what impact it's had overall? And it wasn't one aspect that I was thinking of, but you're right. It obviously has its indirect impacts into the industry up until today even.
Yeah, so we go back to the days of Mark Reed, which I've obviously mentioned Mark on a number of occasions in the first show. He was the first, I suppose, in modern experience. People will talk of, say, Cliff Carey and people. the older generations. But Mark Reed was, let's say, the first school of racing that certainly spat out. That's perhaps not the right word, but there are a number of graduates of the Mark Reed School of Racing that are applying their trade very well in the Australian racing landscape these days. And there were methods and learnings that came from there that were quite sophisticated and continue to make their mark, most notably in the corporate world of sports bet. Since then, we had the rise of Humbleton, but soon after the rise of Humbleton came the phenomenon of Dr. Nick. Now, we thought that Joko knew everything, but Dr. Nick, who I spent a lot of time with person to person in the betting rings of Sydney in the 1980s, he had a son who was particularly brilliant, or two sons that were particularly brilliant, and so in concert with those two sons, Dr. Nick formed an organisation that whilst not as vast as Humbleton, I suspect had intellectual capital or property that surpassed Humbleton, and so we've seen the rise of that organisation. They're also very intensely private, and so through the 2000s, Dr. Nick has become a juggernaut that few would have anticipated. Even though we realised, what a clever brain he was back in the 80s, he's managed to set himself up, or set the organisation up to bet worldwide like Humbleton, and he's left an enormous mark on Australian racing. I think he's really concentrated on areas that were perhaps somewhat untouched, areas of the marketplace I'm talking about. That he's really refined the marketplace in an amazing way through the early 2000s up until now.
It sounds like then, because I really personally don't know much at all about Dr. Nick and his enterprise. I obviously have heard different things about it, as well as Humbleton, what you've talked about, and others. Are there major differences in their methods, even to Mark Reed? If you thought about those three enterprises, are they very similar in how they go about it, or are there market differences that have allowed them to all individually be successful in what their endeavours are?
I think that they all resemble each other in the sense that they're constantly seeking edges in the marketplace, and yesterday's edge is tomorrow's losing aspect. So it's about being ahead of the game and managing to capture those or identify those edges, capture them, and then capitalise on them. And all three of those organisations that I've mentioned, Reed, Humbleton, and Dr. Nick, have sought to attack those aspects of the marketplace and milk them for what they're worth, and then move on to the next edge. I think that the Dr. Nick phenomenon has aggressively identified those edges, and I think, as I mentioned before, the intellectual capital that resides in that organisation is possibly superior to the others, and that's really enabled their rise. Having said that, there was a remarkable announcement at the end of last year where apparently Dr. Nick was moving away from fixed odds betting. The published reason was that it was a relatively inefficient means of addressing the market. I don't know what to make of that, but certainly the betting landscape in 2020 has noted the disappearance from parts of the marketplace of the Dr. Nick enterprise, and I think that there are some clever analysts around the place that are taking advantage of that now.
So generally overall, is that better for the marketplace or worse here in 2020? Have you seen it as a positive generally? Obviously, there are some that will slide into some of those positions and try and take up that position in the marketplace, let's say. But this idea of professional punters are bad or bookmakers see them as adversarial and the enemy, and therefore they're bad and they're bad for the industry and they don't necessarily help. Is that perpetuated with this, or is there another better way to look at it?
Well, I think it's a hole that, yes, will be filled by clever players, but at the same time, you want this expertise to be refining the market all the time. I mean, that's racing is an amazingly efficient marketplace, given that the returns are, well, because of the lack of recreational and mug fill that this marketplace has come to experience. If I contrast the racing marketplace with the financial marketplace, you've got a broad spectrum of players in the financial marketplace, and there is what we know in the racing land as fill, which is money that's there ripe for the plucking. In the racing marketplace, it was there in the right up until the 70s. It's dissipated since that time, and you've got amazingly sharp minds who are battling away there for a relatively small return. Nonetheless, it's clearly a game that's captivated minds, and certainly captivated my mind. But as far as Dr. Nick removing himself from aspects of the marketplace, that disappoints me. But because it's constantly been a game that's attracted and captivated sharp minds, I'm sure that something else will come along. And as much as the retailers, the bookmakers, try and be sort of hidebound and reactive, the fact is that they're still there to be played and taken advantage of. Obviously, that then gives rise to talk about how the landscape's changed tax-wise, and how that's made it harder for players. But nonetheless, it remains a game for sharp minds and egos.
Do you think the rest of the industry are disappointed by the Dr. Nick situation, or is it just Mr. Lambourne and other punters who think it's a very interesting aspect of the entire industry has been lost and therefore it's a negative?
Well, it depends on your perspective, doesn't it? I guess from my point of view, I want Dr. Nick there playing the fixed odds marketplace so that I can reverse engineer in some way what's going on and learn from that. Obviously the retailers are, they would think that they're dodging a bullet in some way, I guess, without really knowing how they view things.
Yeah, interesting. So I remember watching something on racing.com, I think it was called The Agenda, and Barney, the CEO of Sportsbet, was talking about how the last sort of 10, 12 years, or I think all of them on the panel were talking about how it's been really positive. Racing's flourished and there's growth and everything's positive. It's expanded and so on and so forth. Do you think, if that's true, and I take them at their word, and I hope I'm not misinterpreting what they said, but I think that's what they were referring to. Do you think generally we've capitalized on how well things have been for the last 10 years? And obviously we can project forward from now later on, but do you think if that's true and that's the case, that the industry as a whole has propelled itself forward and put itself in a great position?
Well, not at all, Jake, unfortunately. Yeah, so whilst that was a fascinating program, the agenda on racing.com, the wagering side of racing, unfortunately, they forgot to get anyone from the demand side on the program.
Shocked.
Yes, there were some really good minds on that card, but they certainly seemed to overlook the fact that they said, well, wagering's down on the Victorian Spring Carnival and punters are losing money faster, and they failed to join the dots there. Look, the real problem is that the players in racing. So we look at the principal clubs and the regulatory authorities, and then we've got the retailers, the corporate bookmakers. So the principal clubs have sought to address the supply side in racing. They've managed to capture a great deal of the wagering dollar via race fields and then POC tax, which I'm sure we'll expand on later. And the corporates, they rationalise themselves. So we've had a situation where the corporate bookmakers have sort of merged and become powerhouses marketing powerhouses. So we've got a situation where the regulators are throwing lots of money at particularly prize money, and then the retailers are marketing themselves strongly, and that is seen as as a very, very positive development in racing. But if you don't have people to sell to, then you're going to bleed both of those areas dry. And amazingly, we've got prize money levels way beyond any historical prize money levels, and yet the number of owners have reduced, and so we've got we're breeding all these horses that we need to have owners. Surely they're attracted by this high prize money game, but we've failed to sell racing in the first place. So you've actually got to be interested in racing to be interested in buying a horse, and you've got to be interested in racing to have a bet on a horse. And I think both those sectors of racing have failed to address that. We've thought, well, we'll throw money, and that will entice people, and we'll push the marketing in front of them, and that'll entice people. But we haven't actually recognised that the grassroots doesn't really exist these days. Nearly most of our sort of hobbies and pursuits are passed on almost in a person-to-person way. So if you think about, and this is an old-fashioned pursuit, but stamp collecting, for example, I was introduced to stamp collecting because my grandfather had sent my father his stamp album, and he saw that as a thing to do, a means of engaging with his grandson. He was a shit grandfather, but he reached out in this way. And so my dad sort of introduced me to his father's stamp collection, and I was away. I was engaged on a person-to-person level, and I spent most of my childhood actually being quite into collecting stamps. Similarly with racing, you really need to be engaged on a person-to-person level, and yes, it may be great if it's mate to mate as 20-somethings, but if you can grab kids when they're young, when they're finding their footy teams and so forth, then you will have a devotee for life. And we've just completely dropped the ball in that fashion because, firstly, society has turned its back on racing. We've become a marginal sideshow, and we've allowed ourselves to become a marginal sideshow, and that raises questions again about how we've engaged in the horse welfare debate. But principally, we're not getting bums on seats as young people because we're not mainstream, and we haven't worked out how to engage in the modern world.
Yeah, it is an interesting one, and I obviously live in the US, and I see how it's evolved over here as well, and talk to some people on that front. And it was funny, I was talking to someone a couple of days ago about leakage with respect to parimutuel pools and betting over here, and I know you talked about leakage towards the breeding industry, and talked a little bit about the stallions and how that worked last time we spoke. I wanted to ask you about that now, just given, let's just say we have seen a bull market overall, certainly for the sports bets of the world, and maybe the administrators see it as a bull market, and maybe race clubs are pretty happy. If we're talking now about potentially, or if not already, an economic crisis going on, and further to that, again, if not already, a financial crisis about to hit, and certainly here with unemployment going from the highest number ever being 700,000 to hit the unemployment line, and just last week I think we got close to 7 million here in the US. So just the gravity of what's about to hit probably is about to set in. Do you think there's a way that we will address that leakage towards, for example, the breeding industry? And we'll get to taxation after that, but it does seem one low-hanging fruit that could be addressed if we're trying to find ways forward here.
Well, interestingly, this phenomenon, the virus has instantly deflated everything. It's the Great Depression all over again. Although we're seeing political units approach the situation very differently from 90 years ago. But certainly in racing, we are witnessing in one almost a stroke of a pen. Last week we had the prize money for the championships cut in half, and no comment was passed. But amazingly, that was an opportunity for administrators to reel things in, because what's been happening over the last 15 years is we've seen this prize money race, and at the same time they've collected revenues that enable that prize money race, but also put in place revenue collection measures that have caused that revenue to dissipate quite markedly. And we've seen no figures. There's been no talk about the fact that revenues were dropping off a cliff because of principally the POC tax, point of consumption tax. And something was going to have to happen. Some admission of the fact that we couldn't sustain what we were doing was going to have to happen. Along comes the virus, and there's your smoke screen. It's quite neat in a way that everyone suddenly has to tighten their belts, and we don't have to own the fact that we stuffed it up. So yes, we're going to see those remittances that were flowing off to the stallion owners in Ireland. That's going to be curbed in a big way. We've got an Easter sale that's going online, but it's almost not happening, in the sense that a number of principal breeders are withdrawing their yearlings from the sales, and that immediately makes me think that we're almost returning to the 17 and early 1800s, where racing was all about owner breeders, and it was well before we captured the mainstream. So racing is heading into a weird time. I think it's certainly been a time that's been long coming and is necessary, this great deflation that we're going to experience. And I'm encouraged by the fact that this bubble has been pricked, albeit in a very dramatic and unforeseen way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the downward pressures on the industry with respect to the leakage to breeders, which may not be discussed too much, or the point of consumption tax, which I think has been obviously discussed and identified. However, rectification may not be coming soon. I think now more than ever, it seems like, or arguably, it's a time to allow wagering dollars to go further than ever before, just given what we're probably going to face here. Do you think there's any scenario where taxation, from a point of consumption perspective, race fields perspective, or just across the board, is going to be addressed to try and stem some of the impact that this crisis is going to have over the next probably decade, I would imagine?
Yeah, so taxation is going to be the coalface in most of the world's industry that's going to be used to make good what's currently happening. But I wonder if, because racing's been allowed to go on in Australia, I wonder if we're actually going to be put in that, or have access to that particular facility. We may actually be punished because, after all, the point of consumption tax is a state government tax, and there's also the GST that's levied federally. So I'm not sure that racing is going to get much respite taxation-wise. It's going to be an interesting time, as you mentioned. I'm not sure that the administrators actually understand what's going on as far as wagering. I mean, you saw that agenda program where they're going, well, punters are losing their dollar faster. Well, hello, if punters are losing their dollar faster, then that boots them out of the game, and they don't come back. So there just doesn't seem to be that sort of level of recognition that will rectify this wagering tax problem that we've got.
Is the pro punter or the aspiring pro punter relationship with bookmakers getting worse and more adversarial and more problematic? Because since we last spoke, and we're seeing this more generally, but Flutter Group, which obviously owns Paddy Power Betfair previously, and they have Sportsbet and the consolidation in Australia, and then here in the US, we've seen FanDuel and what they've been able to do, and they obviously have TVG and other properties with the Betfair exchange. What's been the update, the impact over the last couple of years since we spoke on that front? Because I know you articulated it very well, how it was, bookmakers were those to coordinate the flow of money essentially, and those relationships had become more antithetical and shifted. Is that still the case today?
I think it's worse because obviously the margins for these corporates have risen, and they've, their standard response is one of, well, let's look at our least marginal customers and make sure that we shed them in some way. So they've really the corporate landscape has gone in a way that in the last 3 years they've basically tightened their belts, and they've attempted to profile their customers in a, for want of a better word, meaner way. So they've moved to sort of automatically putting up prices and at the same time profiling the customers so that fewer pro punters can actually get set. So it's got sharper and sharper in that sense. Amazingly, if you're looking at a situation, and we spent a bit of time talking about it previously, if you're looking at a situation of refining your betting market, then, by all means, put up an automated market, get rid of your form division if you want to, and then let the pros, let the pros sort of refine your market. So Sportsbet, for example, are in a situation that they hate making mistakes, but I mean, they can put up a market. Their book is going to be so large on any given race because they've got such a large market share that they can afford to let the pro punters chip away at their mistakes that the automated market is putting up, and come up with quite a good market. Nonetheless, they're driven by this idea that winning punters are to be rejected at every turn. So we still see this sort of standoff where pros are attempting to get a foot in the game, and they're sort of rebuffed by these retailers that are commandeering most of the market share, and they're finding themselves in a situation where they can only play on Australian racing in the last 5 or 10 minutes before start time, because that's the only time there's sufficient volume for them to be able to get set.
Do you think that's by design by someone? Is that optimal? Is that just a unintended consequence based on the structure and the framework of what it's become? Because I had wanted to ask about minimum bet laws, and if things had changed in terms of options to punters, and whether or not everything's just getting squeezed into that window, or there is legitimate options outside of that window. But it sounds like it may not be the case.
Yeah, well, the corporates definitely saw themselves as good corporate citizens by agreeing to minimum bet laws. They're pretty paltry minimum bets when you consider that rails bookies in Sydney 30 years ago were betting to lose 5,000, or being required to lose 5,000 on a single bet. So to think that those units, the Sydney Rails bookmaker, who may have had a $20,000 book, was ordered to lose 5,000 on a single bet, whereas Sportsbet, whose standard book might be $250,000, can get away with betting to lose 1,000 or 2,000 it's quite extraordinary. But so the corporates saw themselves as coming to the party. Where look at what we've agreed to. We're reluctant to do this. We don't really want to do it, but we're playing the game, and it's specious, really. The fact remains that there is a section of the retail market. It's the on-track bookmaker, who are obviously being forced to operate by telephone at the moment. But they've failed to capitalise on the fact that the corporates have had their wings clipped by the POC tax and the removal of the ability to offer credit. So we've got this segment of the marketplace, the on-track bookmaker, that just cannot organise themselves to take advantage of the situation they've been offered. So at the moment, the on-track bookmakers can promote themselves as offering a good bet at a good price, and they're not probably not subject to the POC tax, and they are able to offer credit as well. So that is a glimmer of light that if they can get themselves organised, that will add to the marketplace in such a way that it'll regenerate a bit of the proactivity.
Well, from afar now, it seems like it's moving towards an oligopoly a little bit with respect to giants already existing and collecting more brands and businesses to get even stronger, albeit you still have the tab, you still have sports bet, you still have a number of different options, but obviously with the Stars Flutter merger more recently and just the way that the middle tier of bookmaking just seems to be completely stripped out. And if you want to call the combined on-track bookmakers potentially that middle tier, or even some of the up-and-coming offerings now, I hear a lot of good things about places like TopSport, but ultimately it seems like, and it may be just a trend in technology and our communities now with all these FANG companies taking up enormous market shares, is it headed towards some form of oligopoly, which is probably not going to be good for those punters that are price conscious and want to have different options?
Yeah, I'd say it's almost already there. We are now seeing the Sportsbet v Tab face off, and Tab, for all their regulatory advantages, have failed to sort of capitalise on their position. They've cannibalised their own parimutuel market, and it's almost like the Coles and Woolies, to use a local example, a local supermarket example, has come to racing with the Sportsbet v Tab, and set to continue by the looks of it.
And is there a clear favourite as to who's going to win? Because it seems like there might be, from my limited knowledge at this point, but is it something that's is going to be a long-term battle, or do you think there is an emerging leader in that sort of race?
Well, ultimately, Sportsbet don't have the advantage that the Tab have. Tab have captured the regulator. There's a lot of synergy, for want of a better word, between certainly Racing New South Wales and Tab, who they see as their business partner. So I guess Sportsbet, will sort of come up against that and be unable to overcome that. So they'll just settle into this sort of duopoly. I know that I've made mention of the on-track bookies, and you've made mention of a very progressive and proactive TopSport, but they're just not set up to make their mark in a marketplace that will avail, that is designed for these sort of duopolies that we encounter, certainly in Australia.
Yeah, I think you might be right. So if that comes to pass and forges in that direction, from a betting perspective for the bettors, it seems like there's going to be limited variance in pricing. You're not going to have a $4.80 chance that's $6 somewhere else, and if you had 10 different options, those things seem more possible than if we do have a Tab sports bet plus a few minor other options. Do you think that is going to be negative, and it's going to make pricing generally fit into a certain order rather than having any opinion-based pricing out there?
Yeah, it's nowhere near perfect competition. It's for those of us that have remember our Year 10 economics, it's oligopoly. It's an oligopoly in nature, and the semi-collusion that takes place in those sorts of markets mean that you're not getting a menu of options. Our shining light has always been Betfair, but Betfair has found itself in a compromised situation in so many ways. Most local punters here are facing a 10% commission on Betfair, certainly on New South Wales racing, which is a hard and bitter pill to swallow. We've seen the dominance of Betfair in the UK betting market, and we all look over there and wish. We saw Betfair attempt to offer a Hong Kong product just a matter of months ago, and very quickly got bullied out of that by the Hong Kong Racing Club. So the exchanges are our hopes for the future, but at the same time the demarcation and the structure of certainly our marketplace here has really shut Betfair off at every turn. So Betfair's not getting the volume that it needs to become a major player in the marketplace, and the other retailers don't realise what an asset, a vibrant and voluble Betfair would be to their own businesses.
Are there any silver linings to come with what we're talking about now? Is obviously with homogenous pricing, it's often challenging, not to mention the other restraints that exist with obviously things we've already discussed and the difficulties for the professional side of the punters. Are there things we can glean from this that might be positive that people can hang their hat on, or are we doom and gloom, and rightly so?
Well, unfortunately, we tend to be our own worst enemies. So the situation that's evolved is we've got these smaller pros all squabbling like seagulls over the initial offerings that are, like, let's say 48 hours out from race time, and so they're prepared to give their intel for relatively small sums, $1,000 or $2,000 at a time. So I guess the setup is that the corps are playing to our egos and playing us off against each other, and there's no solidarity or consolidation on the demand side that would force some sort of change. So for the foreseeable future, this is what we're stuck with. This is a sort of game for rats and mice, and the Jelcos and the Dr. Nicks of this world will exist in larger form, but only at times where the volume becomes significant. And as I mentioned, that's only very close to race time. So we seem stuck with this model for the foreseeable future.
I want to touch on the form side, the analysis, the handicapping, and I love talking to you about it. Have things changed much from your perspective, from what you were doing a handful of years ago, or even when we last spoke to now? Is it a vastly different process, or is it pretty much the same in terms of how you spend your time and what you're doing on the analysis side?
So my analysis model has evolved very slowly over time, with occasional sort of fits and starts that have modelled a sort of a change in thinking. But predominantly, I see the provision of verified times that is available in the Australian marketplace as the current, if not winning way, the perceived approach. We've got this situation where we've got tons of races around Australia, numerous racetracks, and the timing systems are they're either antiquated or they're not properly maintained, and so the edge appears to be in finding your organisation that can provide you with sectional times that give you some sort of meaningful reference. And there's the organisation that I'm affiliated with, which is Ratings to Win, which manages to source probably the preeminent verified times in Australia. You've obviously got Vince Accardi, who provides a similar sort of service, and Punting Form that's a more affordable option for some of the pro players that aren't that well placed. They're all attempting to take up the challenge of fixing the times in Australia, because whilst 40 years ago no one placed much emphasis on times, we've come to realise that to know exactly how fast horses are running is pretty useful, and particularly from point A to point B to point C to point D. So I'd say most of the pros are focusing on getting the times right, and then trying to work out how to use those times as best they can. And I guess in the 3 years since we spoke, my emphasis has shifted slightly from fast run races to slowly run races. So I mentioned in the previous show about the efficiency of horses running in fast run races, and how that brought them to peak fitness, and that still applies. But I've come to realise in the meantime the advantage that horses have that are contesting races that are building in pace. So they start off being run slowly, but the pace gradually builds into the race, and so they manage to finish the race off strongly. And so you have a situation, if we could use 100 as a par, where the race might be run, the first half of the race might be run at 90, and the second half of the race might be run at 110, and that seems to be the sort of profile that I'm focusing on at the moment. That is advantageous to those sort of horses building into form, and particularly going up in distance. One of the aspects of times and how races are run when it comes to moving up and back in distance is that a horse that's running in a slowly run race will be able to adjust better to the slower pace of a longer distance, and vice versa. A horse that's running a fast run race will be better equipped to come back in distance because the pace is faster. And to underpin all that, horses get slower as you rise in distance, and that's a truism. Obviously, horses are running at a slower pace as you rise in distance. So when you go up in distance, the races will be more slowly run. It's a general rule. And when you go back in distance, the races will be more quickly run. So the sort of springboard that you're coming from will be important. Horses going up in distance probably need to be coming from a race that was building, and the opposite for horses coming back in distance. That's sort of one of the key sort of developments in my form analysis over the past few years.
It's really fascinating because I'm sure a decade ago no one was talking about these types of things, probably because the data didn't exist, or if it did, it was a bit scratchy. And now, obviously, you just mentioned 3 separate places that offer this type of information that people can pass through. I'm curious as to how you develop your ideas on these types of areas that aren't that old in terms of they're not decades old, things like barriers and weights and all those other elements that have gone into it. Do you have a community of people you can rely on to talk through different things? Obviously, like that example you mentioned with the par time and starting out at 90, going to 110 towards the end, and overall it might be around 100 as a par score. But those things, there's probably intuitive elements that come into it, and you have to grasp those. But also, I'm sure there's an intellectual hurdle there. You need to pass through all these ideas with others and try and figure out what not only is analytically or scientifically accurate, but also within a racing context.
Yeah, so I operate very much from an anecdotal perspective, which has its own issues. Obviously, there's a lot of ideas that you construct that don't submit to a strong data review. But nonetheless, we exist as a community in an anecdotal way, and we're sharing mainly sort of by social media, and obviously the organisations that I've been front and centre with, the Punter's Show and now Racing Rant, is it seeks to build a community of people that are throwing around these ideas. Obviously, we're trying to find the next winner as well, but underlying all that is a sort of a discussion that you can tap into. And my own output has been referred to as pearls of wisdom, but I mean, they're all ideas that I've synthesised from operating in a community. Firstly, on the racetrack back in the 80s and 90s, and since that sort of cognoscenti has dissipated and dispersed, obviously we're trying to operate from a digital platform and bringing together as many ideas from people as possible. There's a community of 500 to 1,000 people within the Racing Rant that are constantly, let's say, writing in, or they're commenting on social media about various aspects of form that either I will pick up on or someone else will pick up on and carry it a bit further. So it's brilliant in the sense that we're all sort of like minds that are putting our efforts or putting ourselves to the task of refining sort of and critiquing aspects of racing, and I'm sure it'll continue on. Whilst we may find it difficult to play and difficult to get on, and nonetheless we're also passionate about it. That these things will seep through and be worked upon and refined upon and sort of build. It's almost like there's a library developing of ideas that youngsters can, who we are lucky enough to engage in this fascinating pursuit, they can come in and sort of almost be exposed to it and join in the journey that we're all on.
How long do you think those discussions filter down into the mainstream, or how long until you can pick up a paper on a Saturday morning and maybe see par times in there, or see how quickly from a generalized number point of view, whether it's out of 100 or whatever it might be, for the first half of the race or the second half, or if it's a 2,400 meter race, each 800 meter block or whatever it might be. Do you think that is going to happen soon, or do you think racing still kind of drops the ball in that regard when any public discourse on the topic of horse racing seems to be, A from B from C, and also because it's a $7 chance or above, it suddenly is a value chance just because the number is higher than 7. It doesn't seem like it jumps any higher than that level.
No, and it won't, because the regulator and its business partner own the mainstream media, or they control the mainstream media. So there's, as in most enterprises, that's monopolistic in that sense, and so there's no reason for them, or no design for change. This has to continue to exist in the periphery. Obviously social media has afforded us a greater footprint than once upon a time, but nonetheless, the mainstream media is it's paint by numbers. There's not much we can do about it. There's no desire, or there's no insight really. So let's say the regulator pays the 2 daily newspapers. Now I realise that once upon a time, mainstream media was the be all and end all, and now it's almost a tiny corner. Nonetheless, it's still your public face, and the regulator doesn't really have a clue about how to address wagering. They're all focused on the supply side, and we'll pay the Daily Telegraph $500,000 a year to print what we want them to print and to publish our race fields or whatever. But they don't have a clue about how that interface might interact with their punting participants. So we're doomed to continued very bland mainstream media coverage. The other thing is, of course, that racing is so on the nose these days that you pick up, for example, I like to read The Guardian, and racing is the only sport that's going on at the moment, and yet in the sport pages in The Guardian there's not a mention of racing. So so we've got this two-pronged approach, which is the bland, let's put the fields in, and a little bit of racing talk in the daily newspapers, and we can't get a gig anywhere else unless we're beating up a horse.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Are there things that come in and out of vogue, or form factors that you've pushed in and pushed out over time that may have, the pendulum has swung too far into how important this is, or it's gone the other direction and it's not enough? Because I woke up this morning like I typically do on a Saturday if it's racing season, and I'll go to Racing New South Wales or racing.com and I'll watch the replays, and I saw a tweet from the very well-named Jake Henson about the Doncaster, which had just been run, and it was 18, I think, Natoya, from 14 and 19, and it sparks, albeit one race, and we obviously shouldn't overreact and all those different things, but something like weight or other factors that swing in and out of vogue, or is it something that once you've stamped it, it's been stamped?
Oh, I think there are overcorrections. So we were weight obsessed in the 80s, and we were very dismissive of weight in the early 2000s, and I think in the last decade, certainly there's been a swing around to weights, principally because we went to a situation where the limit weight kept rising, and so the spread of weights became quite small, and so that definitely diminished the importance of weight. And in the last few years, we've seen a recognition from the handicapping departments that if we can find riders light enough to ride these horses at their sort of true weight, according to the ratings and the handicaps, then we should allow those horses to run around at those weights. And I'm still not convinced as to whether carrying 52 instead of 55 actually means anything. But I mentioned in the previous program, the participants do get very keen about that idea, and So we've got two components, one of which I'm not sold on, but let's say it exists, that, horses are retarded by 4 or 5 pounds, 2 or 3 kilos. And the other idea that, if you give a horse a weight relief of that order, that suddenly the connections will ride their horses more positive, or will present the horses more positively and ride them more positively, and so those horses participate more in the finishes of races. Look, it's a fascinating idea, but certainly you hit the nail on the head that weight is probably in the vanguard of the factors that went in and has come back into fashion.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting, because I think, if you go back in history, you'll probably see scenarios like, or I'll ask you, would So You Think have won the Cox Plate? I think it had about 49.5 or 50 kilos back in 08 or 09 or whenever it was. Would it have won that if it had 55? Not because the horse was any faster or slower or better or worse, but would they have taken it to the front, and would Bossy have just, let it free roll and then see if the others could chase? If it has 49.5 or 55, I think the world is a different place from So You Think's perspective.
Sure is. I remember, we were all gobsmacked when So You Think found the front, and I'm sure the fact that he was put in that position where he was perceived to have a great advantage, influenced the tactics that were employed. It's a great example, and he is one of my favourite horses. So You Think, the fact that Bart chose him to run in that Melbourne Cup is one of the defining moments of my racing life. But yes, look, certainly his 3-year-old Cox Plate is a fascinating interrogation of that particular aspect of racing.
So before I let you go, Mark, I just want to ask about, I guess, looking forward here, obviously with what's going on in the world and how it's shaping up now with racing continuing, obviously in Australia at the moment, but moving forward, are we going to see certain tracks go out of business, let's say, and we'll only be racing at Randwick and Rose Hill, or are we going to see similar to the Hong Kong model in some respects? But what do you think the overall impact's going to be? Are we going to see trainers go out of business and everything's going to be Waller and Gay and whoever the top 2 or 3 or 4 trainers are going to be the ones controlling most of the training side? Or how do you see it unfolding? Have you given it much thought?
Well, the landscape in Australia is so labour intensive. We've got so many people that racing employs, and I think it might be the 3rd biggest industry in Australia. It's a lot of mouths to feed, and certainly the regulators have bent over backwards to attend to that aspect of our industry, and so I can't see us rationalising in the direction of a super league, even though we've got these principles that seem to win all the races. Nonetheless, the regulator will continue to see its role as supporting regional and rural areas, and that's a point that I think they've really failed to capitalise upon. Racing's on the nose in so many welfare ways, and yet we are the industry that is sending money to the bush when no other industry is. So when you think that there are races being run in the country for $20,000 and $30,000, that really the horseflesh is not. There's no meritocracy about it. The horseflesh is not entitled to that to be running for that sort of money. But the fact is that the regulators have deemed it a prudent response to actually set things up so that there are funds that are being remitted to rural areas, and racing is performing a great public service in addressing our structural difficulties, or Australia's structural difficulties, and racing really could be promoting itself as a great public servant in that fashion, but we don't seem to be to be able to recognise it, or B, to be able to actually get the message out. And so to expand upon that, obviously we look at this amazing Super League that they've got in Hong Kong, and it's a bettor's dream, apart from the fact that they refuse to allow Betfair. Nonetheless, we've just got a different beast in Australia. We accept that we've got a different beast, and more is the point. We're doing a great job in supporting a vast industry that has grown up over almost centuries.
So one final question for you. If we do have a scenario here shortly where racing is cancelled, let's just say we have an 8-week break, what does that mean for someone like yourself? I can't remember any scenario in a long time where there might have been an 8-week break without any racing going on. You and your colleagues and those that are living and breathing racing and have for decades now, is that a well-earned respite from what's going on, or how will you see that?
Well, obviously that depends on the response, of the political response in terms of subsidies and what have you. Obviously, it's an interesting to just step back one level. It was an interesting idea that we set the entire economy into some sort of deep freeze, which would mean no racing as well, and so everyone bears the burden of this current unprecedented situation. So we actually didn't do that, and racing continues with the prospect of it stopping or being forced to stop, as it has, say, for example, in Tasmania and New Zealand and the UK and other places. We did have EI only 13 years ago, and whilst there was some racing that was going on around the place, there was, it was very limited in terms of the sorts of racing that you would be prepared to play. So there's that. We have that benefit of that experience, and I guess anybody in my situation or a part of my sort of landscape of people would probably look to Hong Kong and Singapore to play during the week. They're seen as bettable places, and I know that people are currently skilling up in regards to particularly Hong Kong, with the view that that may be all that's left for us.
Well, I hope if it does come, and I don't want it to, but if it does, the industry can collectively take a breath and address what's to come from here, because obviously there's a lot of challenges. Mark, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure chatting with you as always, and obviously we could do this for hours, and I respect your time, so I want to leave it there, but thanks again for coming on and sharing your insights. Well,
Jake, you're performing the most amazing public service of building this library of thought and analysis and expertise. I cannot. I'd certainly jump at the chance every time you mention, do you want to come on? Because to be part of this process is. I'm very grateful for it, Jake.